Hi.
It's great to see you.
I know. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's our show. No. Why don't you tell the people at home a little bit about yourself?
My name is Thomas Shim. I'm a creative director and an artist. And born and raised in Guam. Let's start there.
Oh, I didn't even know that.
Yeah,
That's awesome.
I'm a territory child.
Oh.
Yeah. Korean Japanese. But I moved here 19 years ago. About to be 20, I think.
Okay, so I would love to hear a bit about what you also identify as bi,
Yes.
right? And so do I. High five.
Good times.
Good times. Tell me a little bit about like your coming out process and how that went.
I've always sexuality and orientation has always been sort of like something I didn't really thought about, to be honest. I never thought, how progressive am I? I never really thought it was an issue. And living in a bubble that is New York City, where everything's so accepting, and I never thought about. There wasn't a concept of, oh, I'm gonna today I'm gonna wear something pretty and come out.
Yeah.
And I think it was easy to come out as a gay man at first, and
So you came out as gay first.
yeah. And then I realized that wasn't me. So naturally, I decided to denounce that title and dated a few men and women, and never really had like official coming out, like confetti tears.
Does anyone have confetti?
Never had
Next
one.
time.
But again, that's because I think my privilege. I think I do have that. Living in New York City, huge privilege, right? I never felt the urge, and also having a family that kind of raised me to be extremely independent, and there was sort of like you to you mentality, which is very uncommon in Asian culture. So that was very liberating, and that allowed me to, in some way, be okay with who I am, and coming out for me didn't really matter.
Okay, and you also what's your relationship with your family in terms of like being a man? Like, how were you raised to think, like, what do you think being a man meant?
Yeah, I mean, they never, growing up, which is again very not so traditional, but they never really enforced masculinity. They never asked me to be a man or act a certain way, but I think the pressure I got was more of in a form of responsibility. Being the eldest child, being the oldest, I had this pressure of being the responsible one, being the one who's, bold, quiet, being, having to be the leader and having all these responsibility, which at the time I never thought of it as, oh, I have to be a man, but I'm the oldest. I'm,
Bold and quiet. Would you say those are stereotypes of masculinity that you've experienced, or like are those specific to Korean or Japanese communities?
It sort of came from looking at watching and growing up watching my father. I think he's a rather quiet man. So like that's what I saw. Like all the men, Korean men to be specific, I was surrounded by had a very specific mannerism, so to speak.
Yeah.
Quiet, bordering shyness, but never crossing that crossing that line. It's very bold and quiet.
That's fascinating.
Yeah.
I'm curious how you feel like femininity has played a part in your sense of self.
Yeah, I mean, it definitely came in a form of vulnerability. Emotional vulnerability is something that I'm still kind of afraid of, and I think it comes with my my career, my job, where it's very so to speak masculine kind of industry, advertising, and I think emotional vulnerability is something that's unfortunately associated with women. And a little more feminine, so that's something like I always kind of
Do you think it's like seen as weak for men to be emotionally vulnerable?
Absolutely.
Like, could you cry in a meeting?
Tears is something the funny thing is, tears I'm a little more generous
Yeah?
with. I think
Hell yeah.
if I see something, if I see another dog,
Oh.
but I think when
Do you
it
cry
comes
during
to
movies?
I absolutely do. I cry when another man on screen is vulnerable. Like, for example, a father, like, crying.
Super interesting insight. I think I also always cry when well, I cry constantly, but like when anyone on screen cries, but especially when it's men, I didn't actually realize that until right
Yeah.
now. But it's because we don't see that so often, and it just makes you realize how much like emotion there is in the world that we like can't crack open. You
Yeah.
know, we've talked a lot about bi-erasure
Mm-hmm.
and just other issues we face within the queer community. Do you feel like your bisexuality has been sort of accepted by the broader queer community?
Um, uh, I try really hard to surround myself with people who are a little more open-minded and who are. I started doing that only because I got sick and tired of explaining,
Mm-hmm.
and I think it also like I think I came to a certain age where I have the luxury of I'm better at like okay you are the conversation's gonna be oh but how are you by and how are you know I want to stay away from that conversation unless you're coming from a place of like earnesty and want to learn but like there's not a lot of people like that but I definitely if I were to be specific in relationship I'd had more difficulty with men believe it or not regards to my sexuality than a woman for some reason and women have been more understanding for odd reason and maybe it's the type of people I've dated but it's always been a longer conversation with men about like but how does that work
Mm-hmm.
like why how does that are you like going through stuff what happened in your childhood
Yeah,
all those different things I'm like no it's just how it
like
is
men within the gay
yeah gay
community.
community yeah it's I, and it's almost to the point where they have made a decision that bisexuality is not a real thing.
Mm-hmm.
They come to you with a question like, "Oh, how does that work?" But when you're talking to them, like like they're coming from a place where like I'm gonna talk to you until you admit that bisexuality is
Yeah,
not real and you're going through a phase.
yeah.
And I'm just like,
I
yeah,
have experienced something very similar within when I was still like dabbling in the lesbian
yeah,
community. It felt very much like, oh, we get it. Like you're on your way to being a full-fledged lesbian. And I was like, no, I'm like I know this is what
yeah.
I like. Like I know this is where I am.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Did that make you? Sorry to ask
Oh,
you a
oh,
question.
turn the
Did
tables have
that
turned.
make you not want to talk about your sexuality?
Yes, but it also made me want to stop dating people who didn't understand sexual fluidity. I think
Mm-hmm.
you have a great point that like you just want to do what's most like you don't want to have to keep explaining yourself,
Yeah,
right? And like and so you end up that's why so many like queer people seek queer spaces
yeah.
because then we can finally just be,
Mm-hmm.
you know.
Yeah, a lot of people don't come out because they just don't want to explain, right? Like in a lot of ways, and I
Yeah.
think some of us we find like representation matters, and we want to talk about it, and but I think there are a lot of people out there who's, it's easier. I mean, yes, it's easier to not come out for a lot of people, but it's easier because explaining is just exhausting.
Well, yeah, and I think as a bi person,
Hmm.
like, and this is what I found. I'm super curious how you found this, but I always knew I was bi, but like I was happy in relationships with men,
Hmm.
so I was like, this is fine. Like I'll just present in all these straight relationships, and I'll just have this unresolved like chunk of me.
Hmm.
But when I came out, I'm like so much happier. I feel so much more whole, which is really interesting because it's not like I'm dating multiple partners. You
Hmm.
know, it's like I'm with one person. So because you came out as gay first, and then you came out as bi, like how did that feel? Like, what was that like?
I wish this is a thing. Like I wish I had a little more emotional reaction. Yeah, again, I didn't actively go out and like explain to people what happened. And it's sort of like I just let it be. Live my
Yeah.
life to the fullest.
Thomas, thank you so much. That was such an awesome conversation. It is always so good to talk to you about being bi and bye.